Hi class, I hope you're ready to learning about arrays. What is an array? It's a list of objects of a certain data type. So far, we've learned only a handful of data types that's standard in C++, including integers, booleans, doubles, floats, and maybe characters. But characters behave a little bit differently, have some exceptions because it's related to string, like text. So we will talk more about it in the next module. Right now, let's think about an integer array. So in the left hand side, you can see how to declare an array of integers and initialize it at the same time. In the bottom, this is the way to declare the same array basically with the same values in each of the element, but doing it separately. First declare it and then initialize the values. In the right hand side, you can see the memory space. Basically, we allocate 5 space for integers, like so, and then put the values inside this 5 memory space of each of an integer's size. So one thing to point out is that when we access the value of an array, we start with the position number 0 and not number 1. And I think that makes us software engineer difference is when we think about, maybe because of programming, when we think about how to start counting, we sometimes actually very understandably count from 0 and not count from 1. So index of an array always starts with 0. So have to remember it, because when does an array ends then? When we start with 0. So we ends with 1 less than the size of an array. When we have an array of 5 elements, we would end with score what? 4. So that's something very important, because if we forgot and read past the array, there will be error. Not only that, you might not be able to call it because the compiler actually doesn't know how to complain about it, and so you would get some invalid value, and you might be doing some calculation and you don't understand where the problem came from. So be very aware when you are playing with an array to not read past the end of it. Also, the size of an array has to be known when you declare it. So you cannot do an int score and then say that it's an array, but you don't know how many elements are there. This is going to be important for your assignment also. So the value of an array element, from this code, I hope it's pretty obvious to you what the value of A is. It will just take on the value of score 1, which is 90. And what about the value of B, which is score 5? But since we have only 5 elements, score 5 actually is out of range, right? And so B is actually unknown, have an unknown value. You don't know what's after that array of memory. After well, I think it's easier to show you here. You only know that there's 5 space for this array, and so what is in here, you have no idea. For loop, this is one way to access your values in an array. A lot of times we use for loop. There's 3 kinds of for loop I'm going to talk about here. The first one is the traditional one that you've seen before, you've learned already. So what does this code do? I hope it's apparent to you that we are just going to assign the value of the index to the array element. So score 0 will equals to 0. Score 1 will equal to 1. In loop number 2, you can see that we actually do not have a direct access to the index. And so if you want it, you will have to create a counter to count, which element it is. And then we are trying to assign each element of the array to the value of 10, but do you think it will be successful? Actually, it will not in this case. In this case, the A would act as kind of like a parameter that is passed by value. So you can only see the value, but you cannot actually change the value of the array when it's passed into the for loop this way. The third way actually can, if you put an ampersand after the in, then all the value of score 0 to score 4 will be assigned the value of 10. Just a reminder that the two for loops, the number 2 and number 3, are present only in later versions of C++ since actually 2011, because compilers, some of the compilers will complain, including mine. It will give you a warning and say, hey, you are using a feature that's only in C, or only after C++11. Another thing I want you to also pay attention is that even though these two for loops are nice, it knows when to stop, but depends on how you're using it, it might or might not be useful for this feature, because in your homework assignment, for example, you are going to read how many numbers there are in a file, which you actually don't know if it's 50 or if it's 30. So let's say there's only 30 numbers in your file, and you declare a array that is of size 50 to hold these 30 numbers, because before you started reading the file, you didn't know, and you have to declare a array of a certain size. You cannot actually decide in compile time. And so then if this for loop through the whole thing, but you actually don't have anything in the last 20 elements that you didn't put in any value, then this for loop might not be for your purpose, right? So be aware when you use this particular for loop. So let's look at how those for loops function. So I've put together just a simple demonstration of how they work. I put the for loop, and then I will just print out what's inside the for loop. So let's see how when it compiles. I actually have compiled it already, so I'll just show you the result. So in the first loop, as we said before, we are just assigning the index to the value of the array. If we want to look at the code a little bit more carefully, you see that I have declared the score array and then say that it will have 5 elements in it. And then I also declare a integer I, so that my for loop have an integer to loop from 0 to 4 basically. And why do I declare that I outside of the for loop? Because I feel like there's 1, 2, 3, 4 times the I integer have to be created if I declare it inside the for loop. So to save my program some resources to not have to create and destroy and create and destroy, I leave the I outside. I want to point this out also because when I look at your assignment, sometimes some of you had done that before, not only for loop but for some other variables also. So be careful as a programmer. Think about if you're wasting some resources that's not necessary by you just making the code a little bit different, not that to make it difficult to understand. So the first for loop, we have assigned the element to the value of its own index number. The second for loop, we try to change it to 10, but we will see that actually it was not going to happen, right? Because it's kind of like passed by value. And then we add an ampersand to the for loop number 2, right after the ing, and then we will see that after all the value of the array will change to the value of 10. So this is what we have. First for loop, assigned to the value of the index. Second for loop, nothing changed even though we try to assign the values to 10. Third for loop, all the values become 10. So I highly recommend that you try this out yourself. Try to write it out, because the only way to learn it is really to play with it, like I've mentioned too many times. So what are the difference of these two lines of code? I think the most important thing is to recognize what is being created. So in here, the first line, a variable called aid as one double is being created. In the second line, it's an array of 5 double values being created. The first line here, it assigned the value variable a, so we kind of assume table 5 is some value that is valid, so the array table should have at least 6 elements, right? So that's our assumption. And then here we are having 5 elements, and each one is a double. Each of the element is a double in value. So this is it for an introduction to the arrays. Next we will see how to use arrays in functions.